Hello, everyone. Before we start, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more terrifying stories like this one. Now, let's get to the story. Working as a grave digger was never what I imagined for my life, but necessity speaks louder. Since I started, I've always felt a sense of discomfort, as if I was constantly being watched. This feeling intensified at night, but I got used to it. I always thought it was just my imagination, until that night. It was a cold, early morning, with a dense fog covering the cemetery. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the sound of my shovel digging into the damp earth. I was preparing a new grave for a burial that would take place the next day. As I dug, a chill ran down my spine, making me stop for a moment. I looked around, trying to see through the fog, but there was nothing. Just the shadows of trees and tombstones. I kept digging, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Then I heard it for the first time, a soft whisper, almost imperceptible. I stopped again and listened intently. The sound seemed to come from all directions, an indistinct murmur that blended with the wind. I decided to ignore it and continue my work, attributing the sounds to my mind playing tricks on me. But the whispers grew louder, clearer. They called my name, drawn out and scary. I dropped the shovel and turned, trying to locate the source of the sound. My eyes fixed on an old tomb, one of the oldest in the cemetery. The stone door was slightly ajar, something that should never happen. With my heart racing, I walked towards the tomb, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When I entered the tomb, the temperature plummeted. A biting cold enveloped me, and the darkness was almost tangible. My flashlight, which was working perfectly, began to flicker, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I felt a greater chill when I noticed a shadow moving out of the corner of my eye. I tried to adjust the flashlight, but the light died completely, leaving me in total darkness. In the pitch black, I felt something cold and sticky touch my hand. I recoiled quickly, trying to turn on the flashlight to no avail. My heart was pounding, and I could hear my heavy breathing. Then I saw it. At the back of the tomb, a woman's figure, pale as death, with empty eyes and a mouth open in a silent scream. She was wearing an old, dirty, and torn dress. The figure began to move towards me, floating silently. Fear paralyzed me, and I couldn't move. When she was just a few inches from me, I felt an even more intense cold. Suddenly, she disappeared, as if she had never been there. I ran out of the tomb, stumbling and almost falling, my heart pounding so fast I thought it would explode. I reached the cemetery office and locked myself inside, trying to process what had happened. I spent the rest of the night awake, the image of the woman etched in my mind. The next day I went to the place where it all happened, but the tomb was closed as it should be, with no signs of being opened. Since that night I have never been the same. The shadows seem darker, and the whispers continue to haunt me. The image of the woman still appears in my worst nightmares, her pale face and empty eyes watching me. Working at the cemetery has become a constant torment, but I can't leave. Something binds me to this place, an invisible force I can't explain. That's my story, the experience that changed my life forever. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales. Be careful with the shadows. They might be closer than you think. The days following that night were torture. Every time I entered the cemetery, I felt a presence, as if someone was constantly watching me. The nights were even worse. Whenever I found myself alone, the whispers would start. They called my name in a drawn-out, chilling manner. I began avoiding the cemetery at night, trying to focus on work during the day, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, even in broad daylight. Every tombstone, every grave seemed to hide something. My coworkers noticed my change. I became more reserved, quieter. I didn't have the courage to tell them what I had seen. I was afraid of being ridiculed, or worse, of them thinking I was crazy. One night I decided to face my fear. I returned to the old tomb with a new flashlight and a camera, determined to capture anything unusual. When I reached the tomb, I felt the same biting cold as before. The stone door was again slightly ajar. With trembling hands, I pushed the door and entered. The darkness was oppressive and the flashlight shook in my hand. I turned on the camera, hoping to capture anything that could prove my sanity. I walked slowly, each step echoing in the stone chamber. I felt an icy breeze pass by me, and the flashlight began to flicker again. Then I saw her again. The woman's figure, with the same dirty and torn dress, appeared at the back of the tomb. Her empty eyes pierced me, and her mouth was still open in a silent scream. This time, she didn't float towards me. She just stood there, watching me. I tried to speak, to ask who she was or what she wanted, but my voice came out shaky and weak. The woman raised a pale hand, pointing to a wall in the tomb. Cautiously I approached, illuminating the wall with the flashlight. To my surprise, I saw something I had never noticed before. Ancient inscriptions, almost worn away by time. I touched the inscriptions, feeling the coldness of the stone under my fingers. The words were difficult to decipher, but they seemed to tell a story of pain and betrayal. The woman beside me began to murmur, her words echoing in my mind. I could only understand fragments. Betrayed, forgiveness, peace. Suddenly the tomb began to tremble. The flashlight fell from my hand and darkness closed in around me. The woman's figure began to disintegrate as if being pulled by an invisible force. I screamed, trying to reach her, but she completely vanished. The trembling stopped and the tomb fell silent. I ran out of the tomb, my heart racing uncontrollably. I didn't look back, running straight to the cemetery office. I reviewed the camera footage, but the image was distorted, showing only indistinct shadows and static sounds. There was no concrete evidence of what I had seen. Despite not having proof, I knew something supernatural was tied to that tomb. The story inscribed on the walls, the woman's figure, all pointed to a spirit trapped by some traumatic event. I spent weeks trying to uncover more about the cemetery's history, but found nothing specific about that tomb. The presence and whispers continued to haunt me, but now I felt I understood a little more. She didn't want to harm me. She wanted help. Whatever had happened to her needed to be resolved so she could finally rest in peace. Over time, I began leaving small gifts at the tomb. Flowers, candles, even letters asking her to find the peace she so desperately sought. Gradually, the whispers diminished. The feeling of being watched began to fade. I knew somehow I was helping that spirit find peace. This experience changed me forever. I continue working at the cemetery, but now with a new respect for what we cannot see or fully understand. And every night before I leave, I pass by the old tomb, leaving a candle lit, a small light of hope for a lost soul. Working as a gravedigger has always taught me to deal with the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was a Friday, and the cemetery was especially quiet. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, and I was finishing my shift. There was just one last burial to complete, a funeral that had been postponed due to a storm. The family had decided to hold the burial in the late afternoon. and dusk was already setting in when they left, leaving me to finish the job. I was alone, the silence of the cemetery broken only by the sound of dry leaves being blown by the wind. I began to cover the coffin with dirt, a task I had done countless times. Then I heard the first strange sound, a soft scratching, as if something was scraping inside the coffin. I stopped, my heart beating faster. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just my imagination. I kept digging, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, a rhythmic scratching that now seemed like a plea for help. With trembling hands, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the coffin. Night had fallen, and the darkness was dense, swallowing any light around. I positioned the flashlight to illuminate the coffin, and with considerable effort began to open the lid. My breath was heavy, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. When I finally opened the lid, the scratching stopped. I looked inside and saw something that chilled me to the bone. The body was there, but there were nail marks inside the coffin, as if someone had desperately tried to escape. The deceased's nails were broken, and there was dried blood on her fingers. Suddenly the temperature dropped drastically, and I could see my breath forming clouds of vapor in the air. A supernatural cold spread through the cemetery, and I felt a dark presence around me. Before I could react, I heard a deep, icy sigh. A mist began to form around the coffin, and a spectral figure started to materialize in front of me. It was the woman who had been buried, but her spirit was distorted, as if pain and despair had left marks on her soul. Her eyes were empty, and her mouth moved in a silent murmur. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. The spectral figure began to float toward me, her movements slow and ghostly. She stopped just inches from me, and a wave of terror paralyzed me. I felt as if I was being pulled into an abyss of despair. The woman raised a pale hand and touched my face. The sensation was like ice burning my skin. Images began to flood my mind, flashes of her funeral, the storm, and the moment she woke up inside the coffin, trapped and terrified. Her despair took over me, and I could feel her pain, her fear. It was an experience that seemed to last an eternity, but must have been only a few seconds. The figure then receded, floating back to the coffin. The mist began to dissipate, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. I closed the coffin with trembling hands, trying to process what had happened. I spent the rest of the night on vigil, unable to sleep. When the sun finally began to rise, I felt a strange relief. I went home, but the fear and the sense of despair didn't leave me. In the days that followed, I researched the woman and her funeral. I discovered that she had been buried alive by mistake. During the storm, she had been declared dead, but had apparently entered a catatonic state. When she woke up inside the coffin, it was too late. Her spirit was trapped, unable to find peace. I decided to return to the cemetery one night and perform a farewell ritual, something to help her spirit move on. I brought candles, incense, and a prayer I found in an old book. When I arrived at the cemetery, I felt that supernatural cold again, but this time I was prepared. I lit the candles around the coffin and began the prayer, asking that she find peace and that her soul be freed from torment. As I recited the words, I felt a change in the air. The temperature began to rise, and the feeling of despair diminished. I saw a soft light envelop the coffin, and the spectral figure appeared again, but this time she seemed more serene. She looked at me with gratitude in her empty eyes and slowly began to dissolve into the light. When it ended, the cemetery returned to its usual silence, but there was a sense of peace in the air. I knew that, finally, she had found the rest she deserved. This experience marked me deeply. I continue working as a gravedigger, but now with a renewed respect for what we do not fully understand. And every night before I leave, I light a candle somewhere in the cemetery, a small light of hope for any lost soul that might be out there. Working as a gravedigger often meant long nights alone in the cemetery, but I never imagined the horrors that would unfold on a seemingly ordinary night. It started like any other shift. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the rows of headstones. The air was cool, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees that dotted the landscape. I had a few graves to prepare for the next day, so I gathered my tools and got to work. As I began to dig, the rhythmic sound of my shovel hitting the earth was oddly comforting. It was repetitive, almost meditative, but that calm was shattered when I heard a faint whisper. I paused, thinking it might be the wind, but the whispering continued. It seemed to come from all around me, soft and indistinct, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease creeping up my spine. It's just your imagination, I told myself. You've been working too hard. But the whispering didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to grow louder the deeper I dug. It was as if the very earth beneath my feet was trying to speak to me. I dropped my shovel and looked around, trying to find the source of the sound. The cemetery was empty, just as it had been when I started my shift. The headstones cast long shadows in the moonlight, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. There was no one else there. I took a deep breath and picked up my shovel, determined to finish the job. But as I resumed digging, the whispers became more urgent, more insistent. I could hear distinct words now, though they were still muffled and hard to understand. It sounded like a plea, a desperate cry for help. My heart began to race, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand, but the whispers grew louder and louder until I couldn't take it anymore. I dropped my shovel and stepped back from the grave. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stood there frozen, waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me began to tremble. A cold wind swept through the cemetery, chilling me to the bone. I watched in horror as the earth before me began to move, shifting and churning as if something was trying to break free. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the shifting ground. Finally, the earth gave way, and a skeletal hand emerged from the dirt. It was followed by another, and then a skull, its empty eye sockets staring up at me. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent now. "Help us," they seemed to say. "Free us." I watched in stunned silence as the skeleton pulled itself from the grave, its bony fingers clawing at the earth. I took a step back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare, a trick of the light. But it was real. The skeleton stood before me, its bones gleaming in the moonlight. It took a step towards me, and I could feel a wave of cold emanating from it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The skeleton reached out, its bony fingers brushing against my arm. The touch was like ice, sending a shiver through my entire body. "Help us!" the whispers echoed in my mind. "We are trapped." I don't know how long I stood there frozen in terror, but eventually my survival instincts kicked in. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the whispers following me, growing fainter with each step. I didn't stop until I was out of the cemetery and back in the safety of my car. I sat there for a long time trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by fatigue. But deep down, I knew it was real. I had seen the skeleton, felt its icy touch, heard the desperate whispers of the dead. The next day, I returned to the cemetery with a heavy heart. I didn't know what I would find, but I had to go back. The grave I had been digging was undisturbed, the earth neatly piled beside it. There was no sign of the skeleton, no evidence of the nightmarish encounter, but I knew what I had seen. I finished my work that day in a daze, my mind replaying the events of the previous night. The whispers haunted me, echoing in my mind long after I left the cemetery. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dead were trying to tell me something, that they needed my help. Over the next few weeks, I began to research the history of the cemetery. I discovered that it was built on the site of an old settlement, one that had been ravaged by disease and abandoned. Many of the graves belonged to those who had died during that time, their bodies hastily buried in shallow graves. It made sense now. The desperate whispers, the restless spirits, they had been trapped, unable to find peace. I knew I had to do something to help them find the rest they deserved. I began to perform small rituals, lighting candles and saying prayers at the graves. I hoped it would be enough to calm the spirits, to give them the peace they had been denied for so long. The whispers gradually faded, and the sense of unease that had plagued me since that night began to lift. The cemetery felt different now, more peaceful. I like to think that the spirits have found the rest they were seeking, that they no longer need to whisper for help. But I will never forget that night, the terror I felt, and the desperate plea of the dead. It has changed me, made me more aware of the thin veil between the living and the dead. And every night, as I leave the cemetery, I say a silent prayer for those who still linger, hoping that they too will find peace. Working in the cemetery had always been a solitary, almost peaceful experience. The quiet and stillness provided a stark contrast to the bustling world outside its iron gates. Yet beneath the serene facade lay secrets buried deep, and it was one such secret that changed everything for me. It was a cold autumn night, the full moon casting an eerie glow over the cemetery. The trees, stripped of their leaves, cast long skeletal shadows across the tombstones. I had just finished preparing a grave for the next day's burial and was getting ready to lock up. As I made my rounds, ensuring everything was in order, I noticed something strange. In the older section of the cemetery, a place rarely visited and often neglected, there was a faint light flickering among the tombstones. It was odd because no one ever ventured there, especially not at night. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. As I approached, the flickering light grew brighter. I could see it was coming from an old crumbling mausoleum. The door, which was usually locked and rusted shut, was slightly ajar. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The mausoleum was filled with an unnatural light, emanating from a single candle placed on a stone altar. The air was thick with the scent of old wax and something else, something rotten. The walls were lined with niches, each holding the remains of long-forgotten souls. At the center of the room was an ancient coffin, its lid partially open. I approached the coffin, my heart pounding in my chest. As I peered inside, I saw the skeletal remains of someone who had been dead for centuries. But it wasn't the sight of the bones that terrified me. It was the small, leather-bound book clutched in the skeleton's bony fingers. The book seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it was alive. I reached out, compelled by a force I couldn't explain, and took the book. The moment my fingers touched the leather, the candle extinguished, plunging the mausoleum into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my flashlight. When I finally managed to turn it on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The niches were empty. The bones that had once filled them were now scattered across the floor, as if they had been disturbed. I heard a rustling sound behind me, and turned to see the coffin lid slam shut. The air grew colder, and I felt an oppressive presence pressing down on me. Clutching the book, I stumbled out of the mausoleum and ran back to my small office near the entrance of the cemetery. I locked the door behind me and collapsed into a chair, my hands shaking. What had I just experienced? And what was this book that seemed to hum with a malevolent energy? I placed the book on my desk and stared at it for a long time. Finally, I mustered the courage to open it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and symbols that I couldn't understand. It seemed to be a journal of some sort, kept by someone who had a deep knowledge of dark rituals and necromancy. As I flipped through the pages, I began to piece together a story. The journal belonged to a man named Alistair, a sorcerer who had lived centuries ago. He had been obsessed with the idea of immortality and had conducted numerous dark rituals in an attempt to achieve it. His final entry spoke of a ritual that would bind his soul to the cemetery, allowing him to live forever by feeding off the energy of the dead. It dawned on me that Alistair's spirit was still here, trapped in the cemetery, and that the book was the key to his power. The whispers and strange occurrences I had experienced were his attempts to reach out to find someone who could free him from his eternal prison. That night I couldn't sleep. The book's presence weighed heavily on my mind, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't allow this malevolent spirit to continue haunting the cemetery. I spent the next few days researching ways to break the spell and free Alistair's soul. With the help of some old texts I found in the library, I devised a plan. On the next full moon, I gathered the materials I needed and returned to the mausoleum. The air was thick with tension as I set up the ritual, lighting candles and drawing protective symbols around the coffin. As I began to recite the incantation, the air grew colder, and a howling wind swept through the mausoleum. The ground trembled, and I felt a dark presence swirling around me. But I kept going, my voice growing stronger with each word. Suddenly, the candles flared and a blinding light filled the room. The oppressive presence lifted, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. When the light faded, I saw the book lying on the floor, its pages blank. Alistair's spirit was gone, freed from his eternal torment. I left the mausoleum that night, feeling a weight lifted from my shoulders. The cemetery felt different, more peaceful. The whispers and strange occurrences stopped, and I knew that the spirits of the dead were finally at rest. But the experience left me changed. I had seen the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface, and it had left its mark on me. I continued my work as a gravedigger, but with a newfound respect for the secrets that the dead kept. My job as a gravedigger had always been filled with eerie moments and chilling encounters, but nothing compared to the night I encountered the phantom. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and the sky was blanketed with clouds, obscuring the moon. The cemetery was shrouded in darkness, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I had been working late, preparing a grave for a funeral scheduled for the next morning. The grave was located in an older section of the cemetery, a place that was rarely visited and often neglected. The headstones here were weathered and covered in moss, their inscriptions barely legible. As I dug, I felt a strange sensation, as if I was being watched. I paused and looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I shrugged it off as my imagination and continued digging, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. I was about to call it a night when I heard a faint voice. It was barely audible, a whisper carried by the wind. I stopped and listened, but the voice faded away. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that was creeping up my spine. I resumed my work, but the voice returned, louder and more insistent. It was calling my name. I dropped my shovel and turned, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing a few yards away was a figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair disheveled, and her eyes filled with sorrow. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The woman raised her hand, beckoning me to follow. Despite my fear, I felt compelled to obey. I grabbed my flashlight and followed her through the cemetery, my footsteps echoing in the silence. She led me to an old, decrepit mausoleum at the far end of the cemetery. The structure was covered in ivy, and the door was slightly ajar. The woman stopped at the entrance and pointed inside. I hesitated, but a sense of urgency pushed me forward. The inside of the mausoleum was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of niches filled with dusty urns and crumbling bones. At the far end of the room, I saw a stone sarcophagus, its lid partially open. I approached the sarcophagus, my heart racing. As I peered inside, I saw the skeletal remains of a woman, her bony fingers clutching a piece of paper. With trembling hands, I reached in and took the paper. It was a letter, written in elegant, flowing script. The letter told a tragic tale. The woman, whose name was Eliza, had been a young bride-to-be who had died under mysterious circumstances on the eve of her wedding. Her fiancé, devastated by her death, had buried her in the mausoleum, vowing to find out the truth behind her demise. According to the letter, Eliza had been poisoned by a jealous rival who had been in love with her fiancé. The rival had disguised herself as a friend and had gained Eliza's trust, only to betray her in the end. Eliza's spirit had been trapped in the cemetery ever since, unable to find peace until the truth was revealed. As I finished reading the letter, the air grew colder and I felt a presence behind me. I turned and saw Eliza standing there, her eyes filled with gratitude. She reached out and touched my hand, her touch cold but gentle. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have freed me from my torment." With those words, she began to fade, her form becoming more transparent with each passing second. I watched in awe as she dissolved into the air, her spirit finally at peace. The next day, I reported my findings to the authorities, and the case was reopened. The evidence in the letter led to the arrest and conviction of the woman who had poisoned Eliza. The cemetery became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking justice and closure for their lost loved ones. The experience left a lasting impression on me. I continued my work as a gravedigger, but with a newfound sense of purpose. I realized that the dead had stories that needed to be told, and it was my duty to listen and help them find peace. Every night, as I walked through the cemetery, I would light a candle and say a prayer for the souls who still lingered, hoping that they too would find the rest they deserved. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales. Remember, the dead have stories that need to be told, and it's up to us to listen.